Welcome to the Meb Faber Show, where the focus is on helping you grow and preserve your wealth. Join us as we discuss the craft of investing and uncover new and profitable ideas, all to help you grow wealthier and wiser. Better investing starts here.
Meb Faber is the co-founder and chief investment officer at Cambria Investment Management. Due to industry regulations, he will not discuss any of Cambria's funds on this podcast. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Cambria Investment Management or its affiliates. For more information, visit CambriaInvestments.com.
There's an area that I think you and maybe Michael Malbison are really the only two people that write about, or at least talk about in general, which is thinking about CEOs and particularly the tech world, and thinking about partnering with these companies as an owner, but also thinking about how they compensate themselves. And this topic is stock-based compensation, which I think for most investors, one of the guys on your team does a lot of great posts, and listeners will link to these in the show notes. But you guys have done a lot of great writing on this topic. Tell me, as someone who's a big investor in many of these companies, how do you think about this topic? And also, how do you talk and engage with the CEOs about best practices on how to think about the subject in general?
Well, you're talking about stock-based compensation, which most people try to turn into an esoteric conversation, but it's actually very simple. When you're paying employees, whether you're paying them in cash or you're paying them in stock, it's coming out of the pocket of shareholders. 100% hard stop. We did a podcast with the legendary CFO of Booking.com, Bob Mylod, who I think has written in the Booking.com annual letters about this subject as eloquent as anyone. But let me just start with two quotes from two of my favorites. Here's Warren Buffett. He says, in 2011, he says, "I think the best way to compensate people is with cash. And if you want to give them a bonus for exceptional performance, give them cash. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's clean. I don't believe in using stock options as a form of compensation. I think it's just a way to get around paying out cash. And I think it's a way to sort of camouflage what's really going on." And then, of course, my favorite by Charlie, "I would rather throw a pit viper down my shirt front than hire a compensation consultant." Okay? Now, I would like to say that I believe more in stock-based compensation than Warren Buffett. I do think incentive alignment in early venture capital-backed companies is super important. But unfortunately, as these companies became large public companies, it just substituted for cash. It was no longer about incentive alignment. It was a substitute for cash. And the way we know that is the vesting schedules on these oftentimes are quarterly. So I'll give it to you during the quarter and you can sell it at the end of the quarter. Well, if that's not cash, I don't know what is. And then the real grift is we're paying all this money out. It's a cash replacement. But then we tell you on the quarterly calls, ignore it. We're going to give you adjusted EBITDA and we're going to adjust out this massive cost we have in the business. So listen, Altimeter is goal aligned. I want alignment. I want employees to make a ton of money. I want them to make money if we make money in the upside of the business, but we need to account for it as cash and we need to compare companies accordingly. And so you mentioned Thomas Reiner on my team. One of the things that we've looked at is like, what's the gold standard? Who are the companies that are doing the best job in terms of not only disclosing this information, but also making sure that their stock-based compensation as a percentage of their revenue growth or as a percentage of their earnings growth makes sense. And so we can put a couple of charts in that show the people who are in the gold pack, folks like Apple and folks like Booking.com. And we could show you these companies that are growing less than 10% a year, but have a huge portion, almost 100% of their earnings growth is going back to the employees, which that's not a problem, but it is a problem if you're trying to hide it, right? You just got to be upfront with people and say, we have zero earnings growth once you take into account the dilution that you're suffering as a shareholder. So one of the things that we've tried to do in Silicon Valley is to say this is an essential part of Silicon Valley. It's important, but it's also important to build the muscle and build the culture in the business that respects it as cash, that pays attention to it, that understands that you can't dilute shareholders by 10% a year over a long period of time and then ignore it. Because here's what happens. When you do that, you know what happens? You hire too many people. You pay them too much. The company doesn't get faster. The company gets slower. You get too layered. There are too many vice presidents. There are too many people just going along for the ride. The most important thing here is just trying to build a way to understand best practices, because we sit in all these board meetings, and I will tell you the comp committees and the people on these boards have a tough time understanding what is the gold standard. So they bring in a comp consultant, and the comp consultant says, you look great. Here's your comparison to your peer group. But guess who your peer group is? 10 other companies making the same crappy decisions. So what you need to do is peer them against the gold standard. Here's what you should aspire to. And it's very simple. Here's what you're getting paid. Here's your total cost of operations, including your stock. And here's what you make. Very simple. But if you listen to these earnings calls and all this adjusted EBITDA mumbo jumbo where they're trying to hide the ball, you would think that this was complicated. It's not complicated. Stock has a cost to the company equivalent to cash. Treat it as such.
Yeah, well said. Again, listeners, we'll direct you to some more reading on this topic, which you know is near and dear to my heart too. But I think certainly spreading a little light and focus on the topic can certainly help as well.
Meb, one thing I just wanted to say on this, that when we did that pod with Bob Mylod and Bill on stock-based comp, I thought nobody would listen to it. I thought this is such a wonky subject. We're not talking about AI or nuclear. It's not nearly as interesting. I think I got more feedback, more questions, more requests to be introduced to Bob Mylod from that pod than any other pod we've done. It turns out everybody cares about this. And the most excellent companies in Silicon Valley, those were the ones most interested. Help us get on the path to the gold standard. What do we need to do in order to do that? And so I actually think that now this is an active conversation on public company calls, on venture-backed company calls. We're moving in the right direction on this. And those who continue to hang out with their head in the sand, they say they're doing a stock buyback to offset dilution as though that's not pure cash. That camp is going to feel increasingly isolated and will get increasingly penalized by the public markets because nobody's asleep at the wheel on this subject anymore.
Podcast listeners will post show notes to today's conversation at mebfaber.com/podcast. If you love the show, if you hate it, shoot us feedback at themebfabershow.com. We love to read the reviews. Please review us on iTunes and subscribe to the show anywhere good podcasts are found. Thanks for listening, friends, and good investing.